So another year and another Super Bowl where most of the audience spends half the game complaining about the commercials. And look, I get it. The ads feel preachy, moralizing, hollow. They flatten real conflict into slogans about unity and safety. They lean on celebrities, vague statistics, borrowed traumas, AI gimmicks. Some resent that they are political at all, while others resent that they're political in the wrong ways. But one thing everybody agrees on is that they feel fake. And that sense of fakery, that inauthentic vibe, isn't because of a lack of creative vision in the industry. It's what happens when these spectacles mutate over time within late stage capitalism. Because Super Bowl ads didn't drift into ideology because these agencies have run out of ideas. They've shifted because the political and economic position of corporations has changed, and because the public's relationship to power has changed with it. And when people no longer believe politics can remedy the conditions of their lives, grievance doesn't just disappear, it reroutes, and corporations have positioned themselves as the only institutions that appear responsive in this sense. And advertising used to move products. A company made something tangible and needed to sell it. And even the most cinematic, culturally iconic ads were tethered to production. Apple's 1984 was a dystopian theater, but it was still selling you a computer, right? The spectacle delivered a commodity. And that logic weakened over time as the market saturated. When most households already had a car, appliances, phones, computers, the difference between products really started to narrow, and utility stabilized, growth slows, expansion shifts towards finance, branding, services, the platform ecosystem, and the center of gravity moves away from production and towards control. And at that point, advertising can no longer rely on just function. It relies on, if products are interchangeable, they cannot be just sold on their usefulness alone, right? The meaning replaces utility and identity replaces need. Brands stopped asking, why should you buy this? And began asking, who are you if you buy our product? And who are you if you don't buy our product? It wasn't about what the product did, but it was about what it like represented socially. Not use value, but like moral and even class positioning. The commodity, the usefulness of the commodity recedes, and the belonging to like some type of branding and social identity advances. And at the same time, right, what we've seen is, especially in America, the law has expanded corporate expressive power. Court decisions increasingly have treated corporate political spending as protected speech, and media consolidation has compressed the communicative infrastructure into fewer and fewer hands. And the Super Bowl becomes one of the last synchronized mass attention events in a very fragmented media landscape that is, hyper atomized towards individual users. And corporation speaking during such a broadcast is not simply marketing its products, it's intervening in the emotional architecture of a nation and of the globe in a way. And this is where, the transformation becomes much cleaner, because if people once imagined themselves primarily as workers, as citizens, many now experience themselves primarily as just consumers, and in the next step of that phase as subscribers, right? Like political institutions, that all feels very distant, inert, and unresponsive. And corporations respond quickly to their reputation threats, right? Like they apologize, they rebrand, they issue statements, they adjust their advertising campaigns. And when grievance is stripped of any type of faith in institutional structural reform, it drinks into this new type of complaint culture, right? Instead of organizing collectively, people review, they rate, they boycott, they escalate to customer service. Politics becomes a form of feedback, and power is imagined as reputational rather than structural. And under these conditions, corporations begin to reassemble sovereign authorities, not landholding nobles, but pretty much platform lords. You do not own the digital land. You rent access to it. You work, socialize, and speak on infrastructure you no longer control. And you agree to the terms of service rather than negotiate them, right? And your access to those platforms is conditional, right? So visibility is also algorithm is not like visibility is not based on any type of merit. It's based on the algorithm, and your visibility is mediated. And where feudalism tied peasants to land they did not own, this new type of modern techno-consumer life ties subjects to platforms they do not govern. And sovereignty no longer justifies itself through bloodline or divine right. It justifies itself through brand trust, through moral alignment, through celebrity aura, through cultural positioning. Athletes, entertainers, influencers, they function like the new nobility, lending legitimacy to corporate power. The extraction remains, but it is wrapped in empathy. So when inequality intensifies, ecological breakdown accelerates, labor precarity spreads, and institutional trust completely erodes, the question ultimately facing corporations in these contexts is like, what are we going to advertise, but it becomes like, how are we going to rule over the terrain of everyday life, right? And that's what modern Super Bowl ads answer that question indirectly, because like they do not defend supply chains or like political practice. They do not address any type of actual structural power. What they do is they wrap themselves in this universal language of unity and safety and healing and belonging. Personal and collective crisis is reframed as interpersonal misalignment. Structural contradiction becomes bad vibes. Exploitation becomes misunderstanding. Power becomes mood. This is not traditional propaganda issuing top-down commands. It is, I wouldn't say softer, but it's more elaborate, right? It defines the emotional boundaries of what are acceptable politics, and it signals what anger feels excessive and what dissent feels impolite, and what critique feels extreme and what critique is hatred. You know what I mean? It narrows the range of like acceptable response to just outright crisis. And because corporate expression is legally protected as speech, this intervention is shielded basically as neutrality, right? Rather than recognized as concentrated power shaping public perception. And a big reason how we got here is definitely from the shareholder primacy, which has intensified that logic massively. If a corporation's stock value depends on brand trust, and brand trust depends on this, big picture moral alignment, then ideological position becomes fiduciary strategy. Reputation management becomes a form of governance. And the Super Bowl ad is not just selling soda or insurance or a bank or a cryptocurrency. It is maintaining its own sovereign legitimacy as like a thing that can retain value. And the harm of these things is completely individualized and blurred by the spectacle. And you see it, these symbolic gestures of progress replace any type of structural accountability, and the audience is essentially invited to feel aligned with this goodness without having to confront any actual power, right? And these little tiny 30-second spots of just like of practiced empathy substitutes any type of actual social transformation. And these symbols, like the symbols that they use in these, like for these brands and these commercials, they are infinite. So corporations invest in these symbols and these brands, and they purchase emotional real estate at scale. They stage benevolence before hundreds of millions of viewers. And the Super Bowl becomes this kind of coronation ritual, reaffirming who holds, the communicative authority in a society that really no longer trusts any political institution. And older advertisements were asking for you to buy a product. These new ones are asking for your like literal allegiance, not through oath or land tenure, but through like subscription and brand identification. And what we're watching here and what I'm describing is it's not just the market evolving. It is a actual hierarchy developing through consumerism and into a public that has been politically disillusioned and structurally atomized, so much so that like these hierarchies that should exist in government and in politics are existing in consumerism and in just like general capitalism. It is the process of capitalism and consumerism governing social life through a whole array of functions, but through mostly through reputation in a legal framework that has empowered corporations to speak louder than any single person or social group. And it is a legitimacy production machine performed on the big screen as entertainment. And it feels fake because it is not trying to sell you something tangible. It is trying to stabilize a system that no longer believes it can justify itself through material improvement. And in a moment where citizenship feels hollow, but subscriptionship feels binding, trust becomes the most valuable commodity on the board. And the problem with that, though, is that trust isn't something you can buy off the shelf. It doesn't scale, it doesn't optimize, it doesn't respond to focus groups or rebranding. And the more aggressively that trust is packaged and sold like some type of commodity to the public, the more that it reveals to the public the absence that it's meant to conceal. And in the end, that absence is that there's really nothing left to sell you. Just ideas. That's pretty much all that's left. It's all the same except for the ideas is what differentiates it. And yeah, that's the world we're living in.